Welcome to episode 2077, 2077, and we have got a fantastic, fascinating, interesting show for you today with Gretchen Morgenson. She is the author of a great book entitled These Are the Plunderers: How Private Equity Runs and Wrecks America. You know, we are living in an era of plutocracy. I mean, it is just, there are so many examples everywhere you look of how the elites are just pillaging the Titanic as it sinks. Now, granted, the Titanic is sinking. However, the question is, compared to what? All the other ships are sinking faster than the Titanic, if the Titanic is the US, right? So always keep that in perspective. The US is still far better off than the vast majority of countries out there. So I think you'll really enjoy this interview as we talk about control over so many businesses and as we talk about the wealth gap. Now, compared to what on the wealth gap too, and I have mentioned it before, but I'll just remind you, the wealth gap is getting very, very extreme, no question about it. It is not good for society. However, that doesn't mean the poor are worse off than they were many decades ago. The poor are better off. See, the pie is getting bigger. There's no question about that. It's just that certain people and companies are taking a much larger slice of that pie than they used to take. And so these are some of the issues we explore on the show, and we teach you how to get your fair share of that pie because the middle class is under attack and you do not want to be left behind. All right, we will be with Gretchen Morgenson in just a moment here, but I got a few things to cover with you first. And I know one of the things you're thinking, Jason, don't you need a haircut? And you would be right in thinking that. You know, my hairstylist, I really like her the best of all the people at the place. And she is European and she goes to Europe every summer. Remember, here in Florida, a lot of people leave in the summer for understandable reasons. They don't like the heat and the humidity. So she goes to Europe every summer. And, you know, I really cut down on my haircuts. I might get 2 of them without her, but I'll let it grow out. But this is the week I think she's back. I was told that she's coming back this week. So I'm going to go in for a haircut. Long, long overdue. This shaggy dog hairstyle is yeah, I don't know. It's not my thing. Okay, so let's get into it. Couple of things. I want to take you back in time for a moment. And our newsletter coming out just here real soon is going to cover this. But I wanted to cover it again on the show because it is so important to understand. So many people are totally confused about the real estate market. They wonder why it hasn't crashed. And they make the case that housing affordability is extremely low. It's very hard to afford a house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. But the problem is they are not, well, let's think of this. Maybe the Beatles will help us. Yesterday, you know that great song Yesterday, right? The Beatles, by the way, just released a new song. Yeah, that's amazing. Help of Artificial Intelligence. Did you check that one out? So anyway, there's that song Yesterday by the Beatles. And yesterday is more important than today when you think of the real estate market and you want to understand how to analyze the real estate market. Why is that? Well, it's because transaction volume is way down. And only, give or take, 5 million people have transacted houses since we had these massive interest rate hikes. So they are not the issue. The issue is the other 135 million people that already have a house. That's the issue. And the vast majority of them either purchased that home or refinanced that home during the COVID era with these extremely low interest rates. So they are extremely comfortable. So as we get in our DeLorean car and go back to the future, right, we understand the market much better because we understand what's important is yesterday. It's the COVID era transactions, whether they be purchase transactions or refinance transactions. Those are the transactions that matter because they are the bulk of the transactions. So you've heard me say it before, but 65% of the people in the country have a mortgage at or below 4%. They have very, very comfortable mortgage payments. In fact, the median mortgage payment in the COVID era was just $1,001, just $1,000 on a median home price of almost $400,000. 10 years earlier, that mortgage payment was $18 higher. So these people went back in time. They went back in time a decade and got a mortgage payment that was literally $18 cheaper. And they locked that in for 30 years. They've got 28 years left on this mortgage. So I hate to sound like a broken record. I wish I had new things to tell you. But we might be talking about this housing shortage for 28 years. That is possible. The only thing that's going to fix it is not lower interest rates, right? That will cause people to sell if by chance we should have mortgage rates that get close to these incredibly low rates we had during the COVID era, but it'll also cause prices to rise. Because if you lower rates in a housing shortage market, it's going to light that market on fire with low supply. That's exactly what we saw over the last couple of years. That's not going to solve the problem, right? That'll just make the wealth gap bigger because people will, once again, lock in on cheaper, incredibly cheap mortgage rates, right? The only solutions to the problem are either number one, reduce demand or increase supply. That's it. It's that simple. So if we have another pandemic and, we reduce the supply of population, that would be tragic, but that would reduce demand, right? And maybe put on your tinfoil hat, maybe the elites tried to do that. We know they don't like people too much, okay? But that's another topic. I digress, okay? Or increase supply. How do we increase supply? The only real way we're going to increase supply is not even by incentivizing developers. That will help a little bit, but it won't increase supply enough to solve the problem. The only thing that would increase supply enough to solve the problem is a disruptive technology, a disruptive construction technology, and a disruptive transportation technology. Why? Well, because we have to put these new homes on cheaper land, and they have to be cheap to construct. And cheaper land is away from the population centers. So we would have to have a breakthrough in transportation technology and a breakthrough in construction technology to increase the supply enough to make it more balanced. Now, we should incentivize developers to increase supply, but that's only going to help around the margins. It's not going to make a big difference. So what is the point of this? Well, solve the affordability problem, the housing affordability problem, sure. That would be good for society. But it is great for investors that we have this housing shortage and that we have this affordability problem because it puts upward pressure on rents. And I know rents have been decelerating recently, but folks, that's not the macro trend. You know that as long as I've been hosting this show, which is almost 20 years, my predictions have been spot on, except for one, interest rates, okay? But let me tell you, I can predict rents, and the rent is too damn low. Rents are going up, okay? Because it is cheaper in many, many markets across the country. It is 52% cheaper to rent a house than it is to buy a house. So that will naturally push rents up. And there are many other reasons that we've explored on many previous episodes. Go back and listen to those if you want more on that. But wait, this picture gets even better. If you're watching on video, you see this. In that last decade where we went, back in time, in our time machine, we had the official inflation rate, according to the CPI, of 26.7%. So basically 27% inflation, almost 30% inflation over 10 years. So we have to take today's mortgage payment and adjust it for the dollars from 10 years ago to which we are comparing it from 2011 to 2021, meaning that $1,001 payment I just told you about in real dollars is only $730. It's $289 cheaper every month than it was a decade earlier. So in 10 years, people got a discount of almost 30% on their mortgage payment if you go by the official CPI numbers, and we know inflation is much higher than that, meaning the discount is bigger than that. So these people are sitting pretty, and they ain't moving, and they're not going to increase supply. Even if they did move, they'd just buy or rent another house. Unless they are going away, right? The demand is still there. The demand problem is not solved. This is a supply side issue. That's the only way you solve the housing crisis. This chart, which I want to go over with you in detail, I know I said it last week, from the Atlanta Fed, wow, it just shows how bad housing affordability is, meaning upward pressure on rents. There are so many signs that indicate a lot of upward pressure on rents. All right, so we introduced our Empowered Investor Guides last week at our monthly Empowered Investor Pro meeting. And I really want to encourage you to get with our newest guides. If you want to increase your cash flow dramatically, if you want to get much bigger deposits from your tenants, if you want to have an easily duplicatable step-by-step plan where you basically have almost no property management responsibility at all, and you can fire your property managers, go to this great domain name, fireyourmanagers.com. I know, isn't that great? A lot of people would love to fire their property manager. So go to fireyourmanagers.com and join us for this small group coaching. I mean, this is an intimate class for 6 weeks on Zoom, easy to attend. Take advantage of this. This is the one big solution that I've been looking for several years to really, really bring to you, where you can make your tenants much more responsible for the property. Not make them, but have them want to be much more responsible for the property. Have them give you much larger deposits that are literally 6, 8, even 10 times the deposits you're collecting now. You collect first and last month rent now. These deposits are huge, okay? Possibly increase cash flow too. Some interesting tax advantages to this strategy as well. So go to fireyourmanagers.com and join us for this small group 6-week coaching. You will love this. It is really the answer to taking your portfolio to the next level. All right, let's get to our guest. Let's talk to Gretchen Morgenson about private equity and how this is changing the shape of the American economy as we profile her book, These Are the Plunderers. Here we go. It is my pleasure to welcome Gretchen Morgenson to the show. She is a Pulitzer Prize award-winning journalist. She is currently with NBC, has a background with the New York Times, and she is the author of several books, including one that was very interesting to me, and I'm glad she came on the show to talk about it, and that is entitled, These Are the Plunderers: How Private Equity Runs and Wrecks America. Gretchen, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, Jason, and thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. So when we talk about private equity, there is so much that these private equity companies do. And I think this sort of came to the fore for the mass population when Mitt Romney was running for president. And, I think kind of some of the stuff they levied against Mitt wasn't really that fair, but, that's maybe another discussion. But, the private equity companies do a lot of stuff. They're involved in a lot of businesses, a lot of investments, and feel free to talk about those. But I'd like to definitely make sure we cover real estate, because a lot of single family homes are being purchased by private equity groups and similar Wall Street related groups, that has wide-reaching impact on what the prices of rents are, the prices of
Yes.
homes are, and so many other things. So Gretchen, I guess I'll just let you start by telling us what is sort of the overriding theme or thesis of the book.
Well, private equity, as you know, Jason, was what we used to call leveraged buyouts. And what that is it's a firm goes out and buys a company, uses a lot of debt to make the acquisition. The debt is amassed on the company itself, not the private equity firm. And then the private equity firm hopes to sell that company to another buyer in 5 to 7 years. And so they're looking to make it more efficient and more profitable so that they can get a higher price than they paid for it in 5 to 7 years. So we have two elements that are important there. One is the use of heavy debt, and the other is the quick turnaround time. And as an investor, that quick turnaround times can put a lot of pressure on a money manager, on anybody who's trying to perform, for their clients. So those are two pressure points that I think are really important to understand about where private equity is in the landscape of the investment world and why, in many cases, that is an unsustainable business model.
Yeah. Well, is it unsustainable? Are you saying because it's too time pressured versus other businesses that aren't so time pressured?
It is that, but it's also the heavy debt. Okay. And we're seeing it right now, Jason, with the increase in interest rates. We are seeing far more bankruptcies than we've seen in recent years. And a lot of these are corporate bankruptcies that are leveraged companies that have been bought out by private equity and that have to now pay higher interest rates. Private equity uses debt that's floating rate debt. They don't use fixed rate debt. And so when interest rates rise, as we have seen, with the Federal Reserve being very proactive against inflation, the costs of these companies, the expenses go up. And that's what's really pushing a lot of companies to the edge, if not over the edge, into bankruptcy.
Okay, so one of the things, Gretchen, I'm always saying on my show that my listeners have literally dubbed the Jason Hartman question. Clearly, I did not invent the question, but it's compared to what? So give us a comparison so we understand, you said private equities use floating rate debt, not fixed rate debt. Is that because they're not issuing bonds for their purchase? That's the fixed rate debt of big corporations usually, right?
These are generally what's called leveraged loans. And so those are traditionally floating rates. So yes. Also, don't forget, Jason, that these companies typically are not as well established and not as financially sound as, say, a very Fortune, 10 or S&P 50 company. And so they have to pay a higher interest rate to begin with because they are not quite as financially sound as another company might be. So, but it is going up. Their expenses associated with the debt are rising, and that is causing a lot of problems. Okay,
so the other compared to what question is the size of the marketplace, just so people have some reference point. I mean, how big is the private equity world versus how big is the general world of Wall Street and publicly traded companies, or give us some kind of point of reference here.
It's interesting, and that's a great question, Jason. But, private equity is a very secretive industry. They don't put their name on the companies that they own necessarily. You don't know when you walk into a hospital emergency department that KKR runs it or Blackstone runs it. So it's very tricky to really get an aggregate number of how many companies. But we do know that 7% of the workforce, 7% of the U.S. workforce works for private equity companies. That's a lot. We also know that at least 40% of the nation's emergency departments are run by private equity. We know that at least 11% of the nation's nursing homes are owned by private equity. And so you see these kinds of numbers and you don't quite get the aggregate, but you get the sense.
Yeah. And one of the things I remember you talking about in the book is how they're so hyper focused on profitability that they come in and they cut wages and they decrease the standard of work, the working conditions of the staff. And they just you got to meet your numbers. You got to, it's like just this hyper focus on efficiency. But it's sort of hard to criticize that really in the aggregate, Gretchen, because hey, that's business. Isn't that, the way businesses work? They have to work that way. And if they do work that way, don't they ultimately make the whole marketplace more competitive and bring a lower cost product to the consumer? I mean, this is up for debate. And, one of the areas where I would sort of disagree with my own question there, because I kind of think what I thought my answer was to that question, is now we're in this world where there's such a concentration of wealth at the top, where the CEOs of companies now earn hundreds of times what the rank and file workers earn. Whereas just a couple of decades ago, that was maybe they'd earn 80 times what the rank and file workers would get, not the minimum wage, the rank and file kind of middle workers. But now they're earning, 330 times. So how was that allowed to happen? And does it relate to private equity, or is that a separate issue?
Well, I think that the corporate CEOs and the ratio that the SEC requires companies now to put in their financial documents, which is very helpful. It does illustrate this problem of the real disparity in wealth between the workers and the management class. And to your question about efficiency, it's really a good one, and it is what their argument is. Their argument is we make companies more efficient. What's wrong with that? We then want to sell them for a profit. What's wrong with that? That's the American way. Plus, we work for public pensions, and so we're benefiting pensioners and public workers. So, but the question is, to what end are these efficiencies? How are these efficiencies affecting customers, affecting workers, affecting pensioners when they buy out a company's pension? So just one example, I think, is very telling, and that is nursing homes. So if you look at nursing homes, and this was a study done in 2021 by very established academics at UPenn, University of Chicago, and NYU, and they found in a longitudinal study that nursing homes owned by private equity, residents of those homes experienced 10% greater mortality rates.
Yep. I remember reading that in the book.
Than non-private equity owned nursing homes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about efficiencies that then translate to higher mortality rates. And the academics that did the study, I spoke with one, and she said, we found that what happened was they would cut staff. And that's why you had the mortality rate increase. It was that simple to them. They wouldn't make the investments in the properties, and they would, but most important, they cut staff. And so if you want to talk about efficiency, I am all for efficiency, but not the kind of efficiency that benefits the owner at the expense of other stakeholders, at the expense of the workers, the customers, the pensioners. And that's really the question here, Jason. Do we want the kind of capitalism that benefits a wide array of constituents? Yep. I think we do. Or do we want the kind of capitalism that only benefits a very, very narrow slice of the population?
So to give a little context on what Gretchen is talking about, context is important because really that sort of sea change in thinking started with who I think was a great economist, is Milton Friedman. Right. But, he also was the one who promoted this idea that the corporation has one sole mission only, and that is shareholder value, right? And, it became just too fierce, I think. It sounded good when he said it. In the context in which he lived, it was probably all right to say that. But it just became like so out of whack that we really have to understand, especially with the massive scale of some of these companies. And I'm looking at you, big tech, because you're just abusive beyond comprehension. These aren't really companies anymore. When a company has the revenue that is equivalent to the GDP of Ecuador, of many countries, it no longer gets the same privilege given by the 14th Amendment. Corporations are people, and they're not people. Okay, they don't go to jail.
That's right. I mean,
Until they go to jail, they don't get the rights of people, in my
I would
opinion.
love to ask Milton Friedman about this because, when he was operating, when he was writing, when he was researching, and I agree with you 100% on his bona fides, the CEOs of major American corporations were not making 400 and 500 and 1,000 times what their average worker was. It just was a different era.
Right.
And so while I understand the idea, it's very attractive to think that you can take one number and work on that number and help everyone. It really did not turn out to be that way.
Yeah, I know. People are criticizing me, saying I'm starting to sound like a socialist, but, I just think that when a class of the population has become so insanely rich that there's literally nothing for them to spend their money on because nobody makes
the interest. They couldn't spend the interest on
it. Yeah, nobody makes anything that good. Yeah, you can't even spend the interest on your money, right? You got to really question whether this is the way it should be,
I mean, if everyone were riding the wave and you didn't have this vast disparity between rich and poor in this country, if salaries had been going up commensurate with some of this in some fractional way,
haven't. Yeah,
it would be different, but they haven't. And so you have this left behind, this enormous pool of people left behind, and this very tiny slice of the population doubling their money during COVID. I mean, it was just insane.
Yeah. Well, I hate to admit it, but I'm one of them. My net worth almost doubled during COVID.
I'm glad for you. Yeah. I'm glad for you.
But no, I get it. I get what you're saying. Many of our listeners are real estate investors, and they're constantly talking about what private equity companies are doing in the real estate market. Are they going to buy up all the houses? RFK has, made that part of his platform. Tell us what they're doing in real estate. And especially in single family homes, but feel free to talk about other real estate as well. What's your take on that?
Well, they have gotten very deeply involved in commercial real estate, as you know, and that is causing problems for anybody who's in commercial real estate because we have the work from home population, and especially I see this in New York that buildings are 40% occupied or whatever, and those are not that's not sustainable for people who own commercial real estate. So that's a big problem for everybody, not just private equity, for everybody right now. But private equity has gone, as you say, full force into single family homes and have really changed the environment in cities across the country. Small, medium, large cities have really changed the dynamic so that regular investors who mom and pop, smaller investors really are priced out of these markets. And first-time home buyers, honestly, are also priced out of these markets. And, we really do want, I think, to try to help other people gain the wealth creation that is a matter of course in real estate ownership. But if you've got these very wealthy, very high-powered firms buying up all of these properties, you're really going to crowd out a lot of other investors.